This little lens right here is the brand new 25mm f1.7 from Viltrox, and it's available in Sony E-mount, Nikon Z-mount, and Fuji X-mount APS-C cameras. At a price point of just $176, or nearest makes no difference, 180 bucks, this lens very well might be a must-have fast prime lens. But is it any good? First, let's talk about some specifications. Like I mentioned in the intro, it is a 25mm focal length on an APS-C camera. So on a full frame camera, it's approximately a 38mm equivalent. So it's a very usable, very everyday kind of walk around focal length. It's not super wide, but it's not super zoomed in either, and it's a very natural feeling focal length. It does have the maximum aperture of f1.7, meaning it's a nice, fast, bright prime lens, and that maximum aperture is made up of 9 non-rounded aperture blades. In terms of glass, it has 12 elements in 10 groups, and I'll toss some details about the specifics about those glass elements on the screen now if you would like to look at that detail. But you're not here because you want to hear about the technical specifications of this lens. You're here because you want to know, is this lens any good, and is it worth buying? So let's talk about that. Now, before we move forward, I do want to mention that Viltrox sent me this lens prior to its release for me to review, but they don't have any input in my opinions in this video, in what I'm going to say, and no money has exchanged hands for this review. Now, first, let's talk about build quality. For a sub $200 prime lens with a fast aperture, the build quality is actually pretty darn good. The plastic construction overall feels pretty good. It doesn't feel loose or poorly constructed in any way, but you definitely notice that it is made entirely or primarily of plastic. Now, it is a pretty bare bones lens. When you open up the box, you're gonna get just the lens, the front cap and the rear cap, and the lens hood, and that's pretty much it. The body of the lens has a focus ring that is a focus by wire system, and that is all you get on the body of the lens. You don't get an aperture ring, you don't get a manual focus to autofocus switch, you don't get any custom buttons. It's very much a no frills lens. One thing you do get though is a nice little USB-C port at the bottom so that you can quickly plug it in and do any firmware updates as they come out. Now, given its price points, just be aware you are definitely going to be making some sacrifices. First of all, it has no weather sealing whatsoever. Just the fact that it has that USB-C port on the bottom kind of gives that away. In fact, when you mount the lens to your camera, there's actually a bit of a noticeable notch right where that USB-C port is located, so you can actually see there's a bit of a space between the mounting element of the lens and the actual body of the camera. The focus ring on this lens does have a nice little texture to it, so you definitely know when your hands are on the focus ring, but it actually requires a surprising amount of force to get the focus ring to turn, especially for a focus by wire lens. There's kind of more resistance than you would expect. This means for video shooters that are wanting to pull focus manually or need really precise control over where they are focused, this might not be the best choice for you. For still photographers though, you can definitely use this lens comfortably in manual focus, but I think the autofocus is what you're gonna care most about, and we'll talk about that later on in this video. Now let's get on to the important stuff, the image quality. First of all, I love this focal length, especially for walking around shooting. I did a lot of shooting with this lens over the past few weeks, and I just think the 25mm focal length or 38mm full frame equivalent is such a nice everyday focal length. I can leave the house with this being the only lens that I bring, and I don't feel like I'm missing anything. It's also a pretty light lens, which means when you pair it with a pretty light and compact camera like the Fuji X-M5 that I was using this with, it becomes a very easy to carry around everyday setup, or even a grab-and-go travel setup. While compared to lenses as a whole, it's a pretty small lens, it's not exactly a compact lens. It's not a pancake lens by any means. So if you are using it on a small compact travel setup, it does definitely add some length to your camera compared to like a pancake lens, especially, like the ones available for Fujifilm. but I think it's a very small trade-off for the price point, for the speed of the lens, and for the image quality that it produces. For wider scenes, there's not a ton of distortion, at least not noticeable to the naked eye. What is noticeable is a bit of vignetting around the edges, especially if you compare it to the Fujifilm 23mm f2. Now, it's not a ton of vignetting, and from what I can see, it's not distorting the image in the edges either, but the vignetting is definitely there, and if you want to get rid of it, you can certainly use profile corrections later on to get rid of it, but just know that in wide, bright scenes, especially up against the sky like this photo, you are going to notice a bit of darkness around the edges. In terms of sharpness, the overall sharpness of this lens is pretty good, especially at the center. At f8, the center sharpness is nearly indistinguishable from the native Fujifilm 23mm f2. It's when you get to the edges that you do see a little bit more softness in the Viltrox lens compared to the native lens, but in the overall scene, it's not a distracting amount of sharpness. It's only going to be noticeable when you're pixel peeping like we are now. In most scenarios, you are not going to notice this slight fall off in sharpness, but for landscape photographers that might be blowing up their photos really large, just know that this softness does exist. It may limit you into how large you can blow up your prints. With the aperture wide open, it maintains the same impressiveness in sharpness, especially for a sub $200 lens. But I think where this lens really shines is in the bokeh. The focus fall off is very smooth and very pleasing, even in relatively busy scenes like this one. One thing that really impressed me was that while shooting wide open into direct sunlight, the Viltrox did an excellent job in handling any flares from that direct light or that direct backlight. In fact, I think it handled it a little bit better than the Fujifilm even. One unique thing that I did notice about shooting into direct sunlight with the Viltrox is that in some cases it actually created a weird kind of almost anamorphic-like sun flare that goes vertically from top to bottom when you're shooting horizontally, and obviously left to right when you're shooting vertically. I'm not entirely sure what causes this. In some scenes it can be a bit distracting. In others, it can actually add a little bit to it. So it's a lens that definitely has character. The chromatic aberration on the Viltrox tended to lean towards the purple side, and while it was definitely present, especially in these more challenging scenes for CA, it wasn't an overwhelming amount. When it comes to bokeh, the Viltrox does an overall good job of rendering bokeh balls, but it's not the most pleasing bokeh balls you'll ever see. When shooting scenes like this with small, direct, pinpoint sources of light, the Viltrox tended to create bokeh balls that had a weird kind of multi-circular or almost busy looking texture to it. It could be a little bit distracting depending on the scene that you are shooting. In simpler scenes, however, like this one, the bokeh fall off and just the general smoothness of the bokeh was very pleasing to the eye, and I have no complaints about it whatsoever. Next up, let's talk about autofocus, because there is definitely some good and bad here. But it's with the autofocus that I tended to notice the cost cutting the most. And I'll explain what I mean by that later. But first, let's talk about some of the good things when it comes to autofocus. Autofocus performance on the XM5 with the Viltrox 25mm was overall really good. I didn't miss tons of shots, and usually where I wanted to focus, especially if there was a face or a person I wanted to focus on, it was able to accurately and quickly find focus. But a lot of that heavy lifting is done by the camera body. Autofocus on this lens is smooth and silent. That is largely because at a sub $200 price point, this lens includes an STM motor. What that means is while this lens is changing focus, it's virtually silent. You're not going to hear any sounds coming from the focus mechanisms, and you're not going to feel any vibrations either. While an STM motor on a sub $200 prime lens is an excellent feature to have and adds a ton of value to this lens, that's actually where I noticed the cost cutting the most. When compared to the Fujifilm 23mm f2 that lacks an STM motor, the focus on the 23mm was significantly and noticeably faster than on the Viltrox, especially when transitioning quickly from one focal distance to the other. The Fujifilm lens was simply able to get there quicker, while the Viltrox often paused in between before it found the final focus distance that it needed to end at. Now, I'm not technically savvy enough with lenses and their construction to explain why this is happening, but what that means is if you are someone that is planning on shooting video and you're thinking about the Viltrox, know that if you are moving it from subject to subject really quickly, chances are you're not going to get the best focus. For static shots or slower moving shots, the autofocus performance in video will be perfectly fine. The good news is if you are primarily a photo shooter, that slight slowness in autofocus is not really going to affect you very much. Unless you are moving really fast moving subjects, then it may be a bit of an issue and you may miss a few extra times, but just keep that in mind if you're considering this lens. Now, speaking of video, the Viltrox 25mm, just like many of its Fujifilm OEM counterparts, lacks any kind of optical stabilization whatsoever. If you're shooting on a camera body with in-body image stabilization, that's probably not going to be too much of an issue for you. However, if you're like me and you were shooting on the XM5 or a body without image stabilization, just know that handheld shots are going to look pretty shaky. There's no real usable stabilization, especially what I found on the Fujifilm, because the digital stabilization caused too much warping and distortion along the edges to really allow the footage to be usable. Other cameras may handle this particular part a little bit better. So if you are planning on using this lens for video, you might have to accept the fact that you'll have to always use some kind of a stabilizer, like a gimbal or a tripod, or your footage might just come out a little bit shaky. So overall, what are my thoughts on the Viltrox 25mm f1.7? Overall, I think the Viltrox 25mm f1.7 is an excellent bang for your buck lens, and I would honestly recommend it to anyone who's looking for a cheap, fast, and relatively compact prime lens for their APS-C camera. Budget-conscious photographers are going to be really impressed with the optical performance of this lens, and travel photographers who are very conscious of size and weight will be pretty happy with the lightness and relative compactness of this lens. Video shooters will find this lens a bit lacking for their specific needs. It's not quite wide enough for vlogging, the autofocus is a little bit slow and laggy at times, and the focus ring doesn't pair well with needing to pull focus. But also, I don't think this lens is marketed or targeted towards video shooters per se. Despite its flaws, the Viltrox 25mm f1.7 is an exceptional value, and I would honestly recommend it to anyone that is looking for a light, fast prime lens to add to their kit. And that's pretty much it. Those are my thoughts on the brand new Viltrox 25mm f1.7. Again, huge shout out to Viltrox for sending that to me for review. If you want to pick up a copy for yourself, I'm going to put a link to it down below. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button. If you want to see more photography related content like this, please hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.